Hi, this is Brad Bright, and this is the God is the Issue podcast where we seek to help you make God the issue in every issue. Today we're going to be talking about the linkage between Eastern and science, the three words that bind them together forever. Let me start with a question for you. Have you ever heard someone say, no, I believe in science, not religion, as though they're incompatible? How did you respond to that? Let me ask you even a harder question. What are you doing today to ensure that your children, as they grow into adulthood, don't come to you someday and say those exact same words? You know, if your child is in public school, then here's what they're being taught today. They're being taught that religion, that is Christianity, and science are at war with each other, that they are incompatible. Now, some of you may say, well, my kid's not in public school, he's in private school, in private Christian school. Well, that's not always a lot better, because in most Christian schools today, they're teaching your child that science and God are irrelevant to each other. You're saying, Brad, that's not true. This is a Christian school. They teach them about God. Yes, they teach them about God. They have Bible class. They have science class. But are they teaching them how God is relevant to science? And in most of the Christian schools, they aren't teaching that. Now, kudos to the classical Christian schools who really do work to make those connections. But most Christian schools don't. So in light of that, they graduate saying, oh no, I understand my faith, but my faith is not relevant to science. And folks, it can get even worse than that. What this podcast is all about is helping you have that conversation with your coworkers and with your children. And it all begins with three words. He is risen. Those are the three words that bind science and Christianity together forever. Now then, let's look at this. Let's evaluate it. Without these three words, here's what your life would look like. You would be driving a horse and buggy. Huh? Ever thought about that? Electricity would not have been harnessed. You wouldn't have it. You wouldn't be able to go to the wall and flip on the light switch. We'd have no radio, no TV, no internet, no iPhones, no computers, none of those things. No cars, no airplanes. You wouldn't have vaccines for the measles and the mumps and polio. There'd be no penicillin. There'd be no antibiotics. You would have none of those things, because all of those things are based on the scientific method, and the scientific method would still lie undiscovered. Now, I know you're thinking. I know you are. You're thinking, well, Brad, I don't get it. Are you really saying that the resurrection was critical to the development of modern science as we know it today? Yes. That is exactly what I'm saying. Let me ask you, have you ever wondered why the Egyptians, who built these incredible pyramids, incredible works of engineering, why didn't the Egyptians come up with the scientific method? Or the Babylonians or the Persians? Or what about the Greeks? You ever heard of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates? These guys were brilliant guys. Now, some people will tell you that Aristotle came up with the scientific method, but he did not. That's a foolish statement, and we'll explain why later. But what about the Greeks? The Greeks, the Romans. The Romans built these incredible road systems like had never been built before. They built aqueducts that were engineering marvels. To this day, they're engineering marvels. Or the Chinese who discovered gunpowder. They just figured out how to make a compass. They came up with block printing. Or the Mayas and the Aztecs with their huge pyramids, what they'd done with astronomy. And even potentially, there's evidence they did some minor types of brain surgery. You see, these folks were not stupid. They were very intelligent, very, very intelligent people. So here's my question for you. Do you really believe that the Europeans were significantly more intelligent, that is, had much higher IQs than all the people in all those cultures throughout history? Do you believe that? Or was there something else? What made the difference? Let me tell you what made the difference. European Christians thought differently than any other civilization in all of history. They saw God differently, and therefore they saw nature differently. See, atheism, polytheism, syncretism, ancestor worship, Islam did not give birth to the systematic study of nature, which is what we call the scientific method. Why is that? Why did Christianity alone give birth to the systematic study of nature? And that's what we're going to be talking about for the rest of this time. But as we're going there, let me reemphasize that your children and your grandchildren will not be taught this in public school, and they probably won't be taught this in a private Christian school either. And you know what? I doubt you were taught this. You know why? I wasn't taught this. I had to go learn this on my own. And today, on top of that, there's a frontal assault on Christianity. It's a frontal assault on Christianity, and your kids are on the front line of that battle. Do you really think your children will be immune to the attack? I assure you they're not. Our conversation today is going to help you help them. I remember a few years ago, I was at a Christmas party, and we started chatting with this couple, found out they were a Jewish couple, and I was evangelical. They knew I was from an evangelical family. They knew exactly who I was. But we started chatting, and the conversation went on for about an hour. And at a Christmas party, you don't usually have long conversations like that, but that night we did. But as we were talking, the wife at one point said, recently my 21-year-old daughter came to me and said, Mom, God is irrelevant to my life. And she said, I was floored. And I said to her, oh, you sent your daughter to public school. She looked at me and said, how did you know? I said, because you said your daughter said to you, God is irrelevant to my life. And she said, I don't understand. I said, okay, follow me on this. Your daughter was in public school for 13 years. During those 13 years, did they ever teach her in literature class how God was relevant to literature? What about mathematics? Did they ever teach her how God was relevant to mathematics? What about history? What about science? Was there any subject in which they taught your daughter how God was relevant to that subject? For 13 years? No. So in effect, what your daughter learned is she can do all of those subjects. That is, she can do daily real life without any reference to God. In other words, God's irrelevant to her daily life. And this woman looked at me and went, oh, can we talk more? At that point, it's getting pretty late in the ball game, folks. I don't want that to happen to you. I don't want you to one day have that conversation with your son or daughter as they move into adulthood and they say, you know what? God's irrelevant to my life. You know what? God is irrelevant to science. And I believe science is true. I'm not sure I believe in this God stuff. In light of that, we're going to have this conversation. And let me say, this conversation we're getting ready to have, I've written a blog that deals with all this as well at brightmedia.org. You can go download the blog so you don't have to try to jot notes on all of this. You can just listen. Just listen. If you want to jot a few notes, fine. But I've written a blog that will also cover these same points. So in light of that, let's jump into this. What binds science and Easter together forever? History tells us that the scientific revolution, that is the systematic study of nature, kicked into gear probably in the mid-1500s, starting with Copernicus. But the development of the scientific method didn't come from nowhere. The development of the scientific method probably started 400 years prior to that, during the Middle Ages, which many historians call the Dark Ages, as though there was nothing going on with knowledge then. It was just the church and religion, and there was no real knowledge. Well, that's not true. The flourishing of knowledge was going on, and the scientific method was being discovered and built during that whole time, so that finally, when the scientific revolution came along, what happened is all those pieces came together. When we're going to discuss what some of those pieces are, all those pieces came together, and the scientific revolution went into full bloom. but it was really built on 400 years of scientific development. Now, most of the people involved in that were either clergy or theologians or people who strongly, strongly believed that there is a God and he is rational. And that was key to the development of the scientific method, believing that God was rational. You know, it wasn't until later in the 19th century that on the heels of Darwin and Freud that this whole perception of the war between science and religion began. Up until then, the general consensus was that science was based on the assumption that God is rational, that he designed the universe, that he is a God of order, and that nature would reflect this order. So it's just been the last 150 years that there's been a perceived war between science and religion. Up until that time, most scientists held seven basic assumptions, and I'm going to go through these quickly. I'll delve into a couple of them, but again, go to the website brightmedia.org and get the blog, and they'll list them all out for you. Okay, so you don't have to try to take all notes on this, but just trying to follow the logic of it. The first assumption was that God exists. That's pretty basic, right? God exists. Where did they learn that from? They learned that from the Bible. Second one, and this is critical, God is rational. And if God is rational and he created the universe, then what we're going to find in the universe is order that reflects that rationality of God. That was probably the most critical assumption behind the development of science and the scientific method. Now then, they assumed then that God had created the universe, of course, and built that rationality, that order into the universe. The fourth assumption really was that God has a mind and a will. So he didn't have to create the universe one way or the other. He wasn't just this impersonal force. He could make choices, and so he could have chosen one of a trillion different possible universes to create, and he chose one. So in light of that, you can't just use logic to decipher the universe. You have to go out and observe nature. Observe nature and see the patterns. The other assumption is man was created in God's image. Because man was created in God's image, he was created with rational ability. If he had rational ability, he should be able to discover the order that God put into nature. That's just an assumption they made. But here's an assumption that I had never thought about before in my life. And it's critical to the scientific method. And that assumption is sin. And because of sin, man's rationale, man's mind, his logic is flawed. It's acceptable to imperfections. Where do they learn that? They learn that from the Bible, right? Now, because of that, therefore, if man's rationality is limited, if he can make mistakes, if he can make poor assumptions, that means the outcome could be wrong, correct? And so in order to compensate for that, what did the scientific method say? You repeat and you repeat, you repeat, you repeat, you check once, double check twice, triple check, quadruple check. You keep on checking until you establish that, yes, that is really the pattern, because we needed to compensate for the flaws in man's ability to think, man or woman, humanity's ability to think. But it's the final assumption that no one had ever told me. And I had never considered. I had always made an assumption about this one that was wrong. And the assumption was that mathematics had always been a part of the scientific process. Folks, it hadn't been. Mathematics was a totally separate discipline, totally separate from science. But because these people believed in a rational God, and this rational God created order in the universe, and they looked at mathematics and said, mathematics is all about order? Well, if that's true, then we should be able to apply mathematics to the systematic study of nature, and they did, and voila, the scientific revolution. All because of these underlying assumptions. And because of this last assumption, today, what has happened? Mathematics is just a part of science. It's what allowed Newton to come up with the theory of gravity. It's what allowed Einstein to come up with the theory of relativity. Let me read to you what Johannes Kepler said. This is what he said. He's the guy who discovered the laws of planetary motions. Let me read this for you. The chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order, and harmony imposed on it by God, and which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics. You see, it was because of their view of God that these guys, these brilliant guys, brought mathematics into the study of nature. And it was systematic. It wasn't just once or twice. They systematically applied this. Now, the core assumptions, of course, was that God is rational and God is a free will. God could create whatever he wanted to, and he's rational, and so he will design order into that creation. This, folks, is why atheism could have never come up with the scientific method, because it does not necessarily assume order in the universe. Oftentimes it assumes chaos, right? We've heard that, chaos theory, all of these things. In fact, Richard Dawkins, who was a biologist at Oxford and one of the leaders of the new atheist movement, it was a group of intellectuals who were saying, we're going to make atheism the standard in modern culture. Here is what he stated. Listen carefully. He stated that there is no real order in the universe, only apparent order. I'm not sure he really understood what he was saying, because the implication of that was an admission that atheism could have never birthed the scientific method, because the scientific method was all built on the assumption that there is order in the universe. Folks, there is no other ideology, religion, even atheism, that could have come up with the scientific method because of the basic assumptions that were made. So the next time someone says to you, I don't believe in God, I believe in science, ask them this: why didn't the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Greeks, the Romans, the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Chinese, why did none of these cultures come up with the scientific method? Was it because Europeans were smarter than all those people, all those cultures over all of history? Or was it something else? And folks, that can open up a great conversation for you to have about the necessity of God in developing the scientific method, which we all benefit from today. Now, at some point, start having the same conversation with your kids. Folks, they're smarter than you think lots of times. Don't lose the battle for your children's minds by default. When they're young, ask them simple questions like, can God think? Can we think? Does God ever say oops? But does science ever say oops? One of my favorite sayings is, I believe in God, I believe in science. God is real, science is real. The only difference is God never says oops. Science says oops all the time. Ask them, can a dog give birth to a cow? Simple question, silly question, right? But then ask them, why do you think God made it that way? Start creating that intersection between faith and science early on. But here's one thing I hope you will do in the week leading up to Easter. It's a fun activity you can do with your kids, and it'll help them make this connection. Here it is. When you turn on the light switch, say, he is risen, so therefore we can have light. When you get in the car and you turn it on, say, he is risen, therefore my car starts. When you pull out your cell phone, say, he is risen, therefore we can text grandma. You get it? Get your kids to do it with you and explain to them the why behind it. Just in very simple terms, explain to them the why between the connection between he is risen and the things they enjoy today, like cell phones, because of the scientific method. This will help solidify in their minds the connection between Christianity, their faith, and science. Get them to do it with you and see how many things you can apply that to during the week from Easter, the week leading up to Easter. Just see how many things you can find. Your kids probably will never forget that. It'll lodge in their minds and their hearts. There's a real intersection between God and science. You see, the resurrection of Jesus, it gave birth to a new way of thinking. New way of thinking about God, and therefore a new way of thinking about nature, which created fertile soil for the development of science and the scientific method. You see, ideas have consequences, but ideas about God have even greater consequences. So this Easter, folks, when you hear the words, He is risen, I hope you will have an even greater appreciation for the power of those words. Those words changed the course of history. They gave birth to science. But you know what, most importantly? They changed my life. They changed my life. They changed my eternal destiny. And they gave me peace with God. And I hope they've done the same for you. He is risen. He is risen, forever tied Christianity and science together.